Myth is a folklore genre consisting of narratives or stories that play a fundamental role in a society, such as foundational tales or origin myths. The main characters in myths are usually gods, demigods or supernatural humans. Stories of everyday human beings, although often of leaders of some type, are usually contained in legends, as opposed to myths. Myths are often endorsed by rulers and priests or priestesses, and are closely linked to religion or spirituality. In fact, many societies group their myths, legends and history together, considering myths and legends to be true accounts of their remote past. In particular, creation myths take place in a primordial age when the world had not achieved its later form. Other myths explain how a society's customs, institutions and taboos were established and sanctified. There is a complex relationship between recital of myths and enactment of rituals. The study of myth began in ancient history. Rival classes of the Greek myths by Euhemerus, Plato and Sallustius were developed by the Neoplatonists and later revived by Renaissance mythographers. Today, the study of myth continues in a wide variety of academic fields, including folklore studies, philology, psychology, and anthropology. The term mythology may either refer to the study of myths in general, or a body of myths regarding a particular subject. The academic comparisons of bodies of myth is known as comparative mythology. Since the term myth is widely used to imply that a story is not objectively true, the identification of a narrative as a myth can be highly political. Many adherents of religions view their religion's stories as true and therefore object to the stories being characterized as myths. Nevertheless, scholars now routinely speak of Christian mythology, Jewish mythology, Islamic mythology, Hindu mythology, and so forth. Traditionally, Western scholarship, with its Judeo-Christian heritage, has viewed narratives in the Abrahamic religions as being the province of theology rather than mythology. Meanwhile, identifying religious stories of colonized cultures, such as stories in Hinduism, as myths enabled Western scholars to imply that they were of lower truth value than the stories of Christianity. Labeling all religious narratives as myths can be thought of as treating different traditions with parity. Definitions. Myth. Definitions of myth to some extent vary by scholar. Finnish folklorist Lauri Honko offers a widely cited definition. Myth, a story of the gods, a religious account of the beginning of the world, the creation, fundamental events, the exemplary deeds of the gods as a result of which the world, nature and culture were created together with all parts thereof and given their order, which still obtains. A myth expresses and confirms society's religious values and norms. It provides a pattern of behavior to be imitated, testifies to the efficacy of ritual with its practical ends and establishes the sanctity of cult. Scholars in other fields use the term myth in varied ways. In a broad sense, the word can refer to any traditional story, popular misconception or imaginary entity. However, while myth and other folklore genres may overlap, myth is often thought to differ from genres such as legend and folktale in that neither are considered to be sacred narratives. Some kinds of folktales, such as fairy stories, are not considered true by anyone, and may be seen as distinct from myths for this reason. Main characters in myths are usually gods, demigods or supernatural humans, while legends generally feature humans as their main characters. However, many exceptions or combinations exist, as in the Iliad, Odyssey and Aeneid. Moreover, as stories spread between cultures or as faiths change, myths can come to be considered folk tales. Their divine characters recast as either as humans or demi-humans such as giants, elves and fairies. Conversely, historical and literary material may acquire mythological qualities over time. For example, the matter of Britain and the matter of France seem distantly to originate in historical events of the 5th and 8th centuries respectively, and became mythologized over the following centuries. In colloquial use, the word myth can also be used of a collectively held belief that has no basis in fact, or any false story. This usage, which is often pejorative, arose from labeling the religious myths and beliefs of other cultures as incorrect, but it has spread to cover non-religious beliefs as well. However, as commonly used by folklorists and academics in other relevant fields, such as anthropology, the term myth has no implication whether the narrative may be understood as true or otherwise. Mythology. In present use, mythology usually refers to the collected myths of a group of people, but may also mean the study of such myths. For example, Greek mythology, Roman mythology and Hittite mythology all describe the body of myths retold among those cultures. Folklorist Alan Dunst defines myth as a sacred narrative that explains how the world and humanity evolved into their present form. Dunst classified a sacred narrative as a story that serves to define the fundamental worldview of a culture by explaining aspects of the natural world and delineating the psychological and social practices and ideals of a society. Anthropologist Bruce Lincoln defines myth as ideology in narrative form. Mythography. The compilation or description of myths is sometimes known as mythography, a term which can also be used of a scholarly anthology of myths. Key mythographers in the classical tradition include Ovid, whose tellings of myths have been profoundly influential; Fabius Planciades Fulgentius, a Latin writer of the late 5th to early 6th centuries, whose mythologies gathered and gave moralistic interpretations of a wide range of myths; the anonymous medieval Vatican mythographers, who developed anthologies of classical myths that remained influential to the end of the Middle Ages; and the Renaissance scholar Natalis Combs, whose 10-book Mythologiae became a standard source for classical mythology in later Renaissance Europe. Other prominent mythographies include the 13th-century Prose Edda attributed to the Icelander Snorri Sturluson, which is the main surviving survey of Norse mythology from the Middle Ages. Mythos. Because myth is sometimes used in a pejorative sense, some scholars have opted to use the term mythos instead. However, mythos now more commonly refers to its Aristotelian sense as a plot point or to a body of interconnected myths or stories, especially those belonging to a particular religious or cultural tradition. It is sometimes used specifically for modern, fictional mythologies, such as the world-building of H.P. Lovecraft. Mythopoeia. Conscious generation of mythology was termed mythopoeia by, amongst others, J.R.R. Tolkien. It was notoriously also suggested, separately, by Nazi ideologist Alfred Rosenberg. Etymology. The word myth comes from ancient Greek mythos, meaning speech, narrative, fiction, myth, plot. In anglicized form, this Greek word began to be used in English in the early 19th century, in a much narrower sense, as a scholarly term for a traditional story, typically involving supernatural beings or forces, which embodies and provides an explanation, etiology, or justification for something such as the early history of a society, a religious belief or ritual, or a natural phenomenon. In turn, ancient Greek mythologia combines the word mythos with the suffix logia, and meant romance, fiction, storytelling. Accordingly, Plato used mythologia as a general term for fiction or storytelling of any kind. The Greek term mythologia was then borrowed into Latin, Late Latin mythologia, which occurs in the title of Latin author Fulgentius' 5th-century Mythologia, denoted the explication of Greek and Roman stories about their gods, which we now call classical mythology. Fulgentius's Mythologia explicitly treated its subject matter as allegories requiring interpretation and not as true events. The Latin term was then adopted in Middle French as mythology, whether from French or Latin usage. English adopted the word mythology in the 15th century, at first in the sense the exposition of a myth or myths, the interpretation of fables, a book of such expositions. The word is first attested in John Lidgett's Troy Book of c. 1425. From Lidgett until the 17th or 18th century, mythology was used to mean a moral, fable, allegory or a parable, or collection of traditional stories, understood to be false. It came eventually to be applied to similar bodies of traditional stories among other polytheistic cultures around the world. Thus the word mythology entered the English language before the word myth. Johnson's Dictionary, for example, has an entry for mythology, but not for myth. Indeed, the Greek loanword mythos and Latin ad mythos both appeared in English before the first example of myth in 1830.